All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. We're still on nuclear rivalry in the Cold War, 1950 to 1957, page 1030. That's like the first paragraph, but it's the second paragraph. All right. The Hungarian invasion destroyed much of the appeal of communism to the leftists of Western Europe and the world. This had already been left in shreds by the secret speech. Even in the Soviet Union, university students and intellectuals disapproved of the Soviet invasion of Hungary. Many literary works written during the de-Stalinization phase of spring were published the following winter when the tide had turned again. Khrushchev struck hard at these groups and continued to do so for several years, with the result that the alienation of Russian intellectuals from Khrushchev became established. This was reflected in the expulsion from the universities later in 1956, hundreds of students who refused to applaud the Soviet attacks on Hungary. The official Soviet line was that most disturbances of this kind arose from the activities of foreign agitators of capitalist aggressors. Simultaneously with the Soviet political and intellectual reaction after June 1956 came a series of efforts to alienate the economic stringency. Wages were raised, taxes reduced on the poorest payers, social benefits were extended, and the labor unions were urged to protect them. Numerous projects in heavy industry under the 5-year plan were slowed up and their resources diverted to consumer goods. Most significant of all, there was a sharp increase in the influence of state officials and corresponding decrease in that of party officials. This reversal was fully evident in the Central Committee sessions of late December 1956, but the following meeting in February 1957 showed Khrushchev in an aggressive counterattack. This took the form of suggestions for a drastic reorganization of Soviet economic life towards a more decentralized system. Undoubtedly, this plan had considerable merit, but in Khrushchev's eyes, it had an additional advantage, since it would remove much of economic life from the influence of the central state ministries and leave it open to increased influence from political party groups. He proposed the division of the Soviet Union into several dozen economic regions, each under an economic council or Sovnarkozy of diverse groups, and the devolution to these groups of the economic functions of the majority of the economic ministries in Moscow. These ministries would be abolished, along with the State Commission for Current Planning, GEK, and Molotov's Ministry of State Control. This would leave only the long-range economic planning policy, Gosplan, and a few economic ministries at the center, along with annual planning and most execution left to the regional or lower groupings. This plan had real merits which can hardly be covered here. Clearly, the growing complexity of the Soviet economy over a widely diverse terrain of people could not be operated efficiently by uniform regulations from the center. Moreover, each economic ministry, because of the constant shortages of resources, materials, and labor, sought to build up within itself its own sources of supply and also had a constant urge to hoard equipment and parts even when they were not needed by it and were urgently needed by enterprises of a different ministry in the next street or district. This hampered expansion and also resulted in a very expensive cross-hauling of freight from one ministry of one ministry from remote areas at the very time that a different ministry might be hauling similar resources in the opposite direction. The serious overworking of the Soviet railway system, a constant weakness in the economy, was intensified by such needless hauling. In spite of its merits, the anti-K group in the Presidium was unwilling to adopt this reform because it would drastically weaken centralized state control and strengthen localized party control in the Soviet economy. The state hierarchy of Soviets had fallen into decay, partly because of Stalin's use of the party and secret police, partly as a means to avoid the use of the fraudulent democratic Soviet constitution and of its federalist features. As a consequence, the state hierarchy lacked effective or flexible control down through its levels, while the party hierarchy had these well developed. Much of the state's power locally was exercised through the economic ministries, which Khrushchev now wished to abolish. And because of his control of the party, and through it of the party press, headed by Pravda, Khrushchev could keep up a steady drum of propaganda for his economic reorganization. Every local figure was for it, and it appeared to other rival leaders as an anti-state move. Khrushchev, on the other hand, could make the opposition seem anti-party with all the treasonable overtones Stalin had given to that expression. The Economic Reorganization Law was passed on May 10, 1957, abolishing 25 economic ministries, retaining 19, and developing their functions to 29 regional Sovnarkozy. The State Economic Commission, GEK, was also abolished, leaving as the only central economic control the State Committee for Long-Term Planning under Yusef Kuzmin, a Khrushchev party official who simultaneously became first deputy prime minister of the Soviet Union. Shepilov was restored to secretaryship of the Central Committee, which he had lost in December. These changes were pushed through by an alliance of the party, the army, and all the forces of localism, both economic and state. Khrushchev had won a great victory, which could make the party dominant in economic life. Having failed to block Khrushchev's economic plans, his rivals in the Presidium were reduced to a last resort. They had to get rid of the man himself. On June 18th, at a meeting of the Presidium, the motion was made to remove Khrushchev as first party secretary. The discussion grew violent, with Malenkov and Molotov attacking Khrushchev, and Khrushchev defending himself. He was accused of practicing a cult of personality of his own, of ideological aberrations which threatened the solidarity of communism, and of economic mismanagement. It soon became clear that the vote was 7-4 against him, with Mikoyan Kirishenko and Suslov his only supporters. He was offered the reduced position of Minister of Agriculture. Khrushchev refused to accept the result, denying that the Presidium had authority to remove a first secretary and appealing to the Central Committee. The members of this larger group joined in the discussion as they arrived, while Khrushchev's supporters sought to delay a final vote until his men could come in from their party post in the provinces. Marshal Zhukov provided army planes to bring in the most distant and more reliable ones. The discussion became bitter, especially when Zhukov threatened to produce documentary evidence that Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich had been deeply involved in the bloody purges of 1937. Madame Furtseva, who was, like Zhukov, an alternate member of the Presidium, filibustered with a speech of 6 hours. Surprisingly, Khrushchev's agent, Shipilov, spoke against him, but M.A. Suslov, the head of the security police and the most cold-blooded killer left in the Soviet Union, shifted to Khrushchev's side. Eventually, there were 309 members present, with 215 wanting the floor, over 60 actually making speeches. When the vote was finally taken, Khrushchev's loyal supporters in the party hierarchy voted for him solidly, and his removal, already voted by the Presidium, was reversed. Khrushchev at once counterattacked. He moved and carried the expulsion from the Presidium of Malenkov, Molotov, Kaganovich, and Shepilov for anti-party activities. Then came the election of a new Presidium, from which Pervyukin and Subaru, the two strongest supporters of a centralized state-controlled economy, were also removed. Pervyukin became an alternate member, but Saburov was dropped completely. The new Presidium had 15 full members instead of the previous 11, and 9 alternate members instead of 6. The old alternate members, Zhukov, Furtseva, L.I. Brezhnev, and N.M. Shivernik, who had supported Khrushchev, were moved up to be full members, joining the holdovers Khrushchev, Bulganin, Kiryshenko, Mikoyan, Suslov, Voroshilov, while 5 loyal agents of Khrushchev, led by Aristov and F.R. Kozlov, were added. This change of July 23, 1957, was Khrushchev's most smashing personal victory and the most significant event in Russia's internal history after the death of Stalin. It led Khrushchev to a position of political power more complete, except for the ambiguous position in the army, than Stalin's had been, although it was clear that Khrushchev would never be allowed to abuse his power the way Stalin had done. Khrushchev did not rest on his oars. During the summer of 1957, he made notable concessions to the peasants, especially the ending of compulsory deliveries from the producers of their personal plots, slammed down the lid on freedom of writers and artists with a strict cultural directive of August 28th, pushed vigorously both the Virgin Lands scheme and the decentralization of industry, and worked to curtail the growing autonomy of the armed forces. On October 27th, while Zhukov was in Albania, he was removed from the Ministry of Defense and at the same time was dropped from the Central Committee because of unsatisfactory cooperation with the party's political work in the army. The next few months saw a twofold advance of party influence, on a lesser scale into the army and on a greater scale both directly and through the intermediary of the revived trade unions into the new regional economic councils. The final cap of Khrushchev's rise to power came in the spring of 1958, following the election and assembly of the new Supreme Soviet on March 28th. Bulganin resigned as premier and was replaced by Khrushchev. In the autumn, Bulganin, who had cooperated so well with the new autocrat's rise to power, was expelled from the Presidium and condemned as an enemy of the party. This left Khrushchev as complete ruler of the Soviet Union, head of both state and party, as Stalin had been, but resting his power more on the latter than on the former. In the 5 years following Stalin's death, military strategy in the Soviet Union underwent a major debate almost as confused as the simultaneous debate going on in the United States during the Eisenhower's presidency. On the whole, the range of theories of war, both strategic and tactical, was much less in the Soviet Union than in the United States, and changes have been much slower. but the basic issues were the same. The orthodox military ideas of the Russians, like everything else, had been stated by Stalin and were not allowed to change under the impact of new ideas or of new weapons until after his death. Thus, Stalin orthodoxy regarded war as a struggle between whole societies, each with its distinctive way of life, and judged that the outcome would be determined by what is called the permanently operating factors. These factors emphasize the characteristics of the society, such as industrial strength, morale, level of training, and reserve forces. Other accidental factors, such as weather, surprise, ability of individual commanders, even Napoleon, or the outcome of single battles, were regarded as of little significance. Accordingly, the Russians had no faith in lighting wars or strategic bombing in new or, above all, absolute weapons. I guess you could say lighting wars. It's kind of weird wording. To them, victory was achieved by destruction of the enemy's armed forces by a series of blows and conflicts over a long time, during which the permanent factors, especially the forces of industrial strength and national morale, would be decisive. They regarded attacks on the enemy's population, cities, or industries as wasted effort, except where these could be directly linked to a battle. And each battle would be determined by a balance of force from all branches of the defense services, persistently concentrating on the enemy forces over extensive time and space. In this outlook, there was no place for the nuclear bomb, for strategic air attack, or for 24-hour wars, and accordingly the American possession of the A-bomb was largely ignored. Protest against its use and the desire to outlaw it were undoubtedly based on the fact that it was an American monopoly, but the Russian objective to city bombing or to strategic terror of the V2 kind as ineffective and a waste of resources was undoubtedly sincere. Soviet efforts to get the A-bomb and the H-bomb and to build up a fleet of Tu-4s were partly a desire to possess what the enemy had, partly based on a desire to deter our use of SAC against Russia, and partly derived from Stalin's astonishment at the damage our strategic bombers had inflicted on Berlin. But none of these had much influence on Soviet military thinking. A change in strategic thinking arose in 1954 as a consequence of a debate among Soviet military leaders over the role of surprise in military victory. The possibility of a sudden American nuclear attack on Russia from the air had to be examined. As a consequence of this dispute, the role of surprise was considerably increased, although there was no general feeling that it could be decisive or even that wars might be shortened as a result of nuclear weapons. To this day, the Soviet leaders still believe that victory will go to their country after a long war of mass forces using a balance of all arms and weapons. But they now include in this balance of weapons nuclear arms at all stages and ranges. However, they do not believe, as many Americans do, that strategic bombing can be decisive. It is simply an additional arm added on to the older arsenal, and will be used in war against military objectives primarily because wars are fought with the military sectors of society. As a consequence of these views, the Soviet Union has no idea of being able to achieve military victory over the United States simply because they have no method of occupying the territory of the United States at any stage in the war. They hope to defeat the United States as a society by nonviolent means: propaganda, subversion, economic collapse, and diplomatic isolation. If the rivalry with the United States comes to the violent stage, they have every hope that the Soviet Union itself will not be directly involved, but can wear the United States down by fighting them through third parties, as in Korea, like the proxy wars. The Russians generally reject the idea of mutual annihilation or the total destruction of all civilization in war, and insist that any war, however severe, will leave some remnant of the Soviet Union surviving as victor on the field. They accept the possibility of limited war in a geographical sense, but have little hope of any war limited to non-nuclear weapons, because this would be, they feel, to their advantage and, accordingly, not acceptable to us. Thus, they are unlikely to use nuclear weapons first, although fully prepared to resort to them once they are used by an enemy. One confusing consequence of the Soviet discussion of the role of surprise in war was an effort to distinguish between preventative and preemptive war, because the generals, planners, and staff theorists were convinced that the West must be aggressive because of the contradictions of the capitalist economic system. They were convinced that they were in danger of surprise attack by SAC. Their weakness in this aspect of war made it unlikely that their retaliatory strike would be of decisive significance, so they developed the theory of preemptive strike. This said that they would counter-surprise our surprise attack by beating us to the punch with their nuclear attack. Such a preemptive strike would be justified only on the basis of conclusive evidence that we were about to launch a surprise attack, since our retaliatory strike after their preemptive strike would still be very damaging to them. The problem arises, however, as to how they can ever be sure that we are about to attack them, and failing that, how does such a preemptive war differ from a preventative war, which the Soviet abjures because it is unnecessary to them? Abjures. I don't even know what that word means. Soviet military thinkers have been very reluctant to accept any theories of nuclear deterrence or of limited war under an umbrella of nuclear deterrence, since war is a struggle to the death by antithetical societies. Such societies will, in war, use any weapons they have. Accordingly, the Soviet Union believes that any general war involving the United States and themselves would be a nuclear war in which their ground forces, with tactical air support and nuclear weapons of all sizes and ranges, would fight its way overland against nuclear-armed enemies to occupy most of Europe and possibly Asia. They believe that there are three defenses against tactical nuclear weapons. 1. Dispersal of their own forces as widely as possible until the last moment before assault. 2. Contact as rapidly and as closely as possible with the enemy in order to deter the enemy from the use of nuclear weapons, which would also destroy its own forces. And 3. Protection of as many of their troops as possible under cover, usually in tanks. The first two of these place great emphasis on rapid mobility of troops, and the third helps to provide this. Accordingly, the Russians anticipate the use of many, if not entirely armed forces in overrunning Europe, and very extensive use of air transport of troops with conventional planes, gliders, and helicopters. Such mobility will allow Europe to be overrun rapidly, creating a situation which, they feel, will make a victory for the West impossible, while our strategic attack on the Soviet Union itself will be reduced and eventually ended by strong defensive measures and retaliation. However, such a war, which would jeopardize the communist way of life by threatening the Soviet Union, is only accurate the Soviet Union, its only accurate embodiment, is regarded by the Soviet leaders as highly undesirable and to be avoided at almost any cost, while they, in a period of almost endless Cold War, can seek to destroy capitalist society by nonviolent means or by local violence of third parties. This theory of nibbling the capitalist world to death is combined with a tactic which would resist capitalist imperialism by encouraging anti-colonialism. Such a change called forth, on the part of the United States, a defensive tactic which shifted from Dulles' insistence that the uncommitted nations must join the West to the more moderate aim of keeping them from becoming communist. This shift in aims, in reference to the uncommitted nations, occurred in both the Soviet Union and the United States and is of major importance in creating the contemporary world. Stalin and Dulles saw the world largely in black and white terms. Who was not with them was obviously against them. Accordingly, the world must either be slave or free, each man applying the former adjective to his opponent's side and the more favorable latter term to his own group. They were enemies, but they agreed basically that the world must be a two-power system. This meant that each was aggressive in terms of the uncommitted nations because each insisted that these must either join his own side or be regarded and treated as an enemy. The great change which occurred in the middle of the 1950s was that both of the superpowers had to recognize that most of the uncommitted nations were too weak, too backwards, and too independent to be forced to be either capitalist or communist. They had to be something different, something of their own. This view was forced upon the superpowers with perhaps greater difficulty in Washington than in the Kremlin, but it was an aspect of reality which had to be recognized. From it came the acceptance of neutralism and the rise of the buffer fringe. This shift was a double one. On the one hand, it meant that the superpowers' attitude towards the buffer fringe shifted from a basically offensive one to a basically defensive one, shifted from an effort to get them to join one's own side to an effort to keep them from joining the opponent's side. And at the same time, it marked the first beginnings of true wisdom and true hope for the world's future in recognition that there are more than two alternate fashions for organizing and functioning economic, social, and political systems. In the long run, this recognition will be a victory for the West, for the West has always, in its real nature, recognized that reality is diverse and is pure pluralist, while it has been the Russian way to insist that reality is dualistic, with each extreme necessarily monistic and uniform. The acceptance of diversity and pluralism by the inevitable failure of both capitalism and communism in the buffer fringe has forced the West to accept and apply its own, often unrecognized, traditions. Moreover, the forcing of this recognition upon both the Soviet Union and the West in respect to the buffer fringe may have the consequence in time of forcing each of these to accept it in respect to their internal systems. Here again, this would mark a great victory for the West because the acceptance of diversity and pluralism is part of the tradition of the West and is not acceptable to Russia, whose traditions have always been basically dualistic, seeing reality as a contrast between an unattainable idea of perfection and a horrible, sinful morass of ordinary living, the imperfections of the latter being acceptable as a necessary consequence of the unattainability of the former, with both extremes being uniform and one. Such an acceptance will reduce the tension of the Cold War by allowing each polar superpower to develop features of a mixed system which will make them approach each other and their characteristics of organization, a development which is, of course, already apparent to any unbiased observer. The shift from dualism to pluralism and from uniformity to diversity was forced upon the Soviet Union in its most critical form by the rise of Titoism. This, of course, was chiefly evident in Europe, where conditions of industrial development make it more reasonable for the Kremlin leaders to expect the Soviet example to be followed slavishly by non capitalist states. The same lesson should, however, have been learned even earlier in Asia, because there it became evident to many observers that most nations were neither able nor willing to follow either the Soviet Union or the United States. This observation, however, was impossible under Stalin because his false theories of the nature of both capitalism and imperialism made him regard the two as identical and thus to regard colonial areas as being parts of the capitalist system. As a consequence of these intellectual errors, the Kremlin under Stalin was prepared to see the fringes of Asia either continuing as colonial areas or breaking away from European domination to become communist zones, but it did not see the possibility of them becoming non communist and non colonial independent states. This meant that where Stalin intervened in certain areas of Asia, he intervened on behalf of the microscopic communist parties and rebuffed the local native nationalist anti colonialist groups. Khrushchev, as we shall see, did the opposite. Stalin's policy was quite bankrupt even before his death, and it was thus fairly easy for his successors to abandon it and to adopt a more feasible policy of communist cooperation with local anti colonial and thus largely anti Western forces to detach them as new, independent, but still non communist nations from the West. The Soviet assistance to such new nations was largely economic, although the limited productivity of the Soviet Union's own economic system, especially in food, made any substantial foreign aid to neutral nations a considerable burden on the Soviet Union itself. For this reason, much of the burden of such foreign aid was pushed into the Soviet satellite states, especially Czechoslovakia. The shift in the Soviet attitude towards neutralism was helped by Dulles' refusal to accept the existence of neutralism. His rebuffs tended to drive those areas which wanted to be neutral into the arms of Russia, because the new nations of the developing buffer fringe valued their independence above all else. The Russian acceptance of neutralism may be dated about 1954, while Dulles still felt strongly adverse to neutralism 4 or even 5 years later. This gave the Soviet Union a chronological advantage which served in some small degree to compensate for its many disadvantages in the basic struggle to win the favor of the neutrals. While these changes were occurring, the strategic debate in the Soviet Union continued. In this subject, also, the fact that the Soviet Union was straining its economic resources was of great importance. The demands of the unsuccessful Soviet agricultural program made it necessary to put more and more manpower into agriculture at the very time that the demands of the defense effort and civilian economy and the rampant waste and inefficiency in the Soviet system were increasing the demands for manpower in industry. Moreover, the heavy casualties of the period 1928 to 1945 from purges and warfare had reduced the population figures and the birth rate to such a degree that the Soviet population figures, even in 1970, would be tens of millions below normal. The only source from which such demands for manpower could be met was in the conventionally armed units of the Soviet defense forces. As a consequence of these conditions, the Soviet defense strategy debate from 1955 onward took a form somewhat parallel to that going on in the United States. That is, some of the political leaders, including Khrushchev, began to force upon the Soviet military leaders a shift in emphasis from mass conventional forces towards greater reliance upon strategic bombers and missiles. Khrushchev's version of Eisenhower's New Look, in which the latter bigger bang for a buck was played by a Soviet version of more rubble for a ruble, was adopted by Soviet Chief of Staff Marshal Sokolovsky and less vigorously by Defense Minister Marshal Malinovsky. The former's view was stated in a widely read book, Military Strategy, published in Moscow in September 1962, but it is quite clear that the military leaders were prepared to yield slowly to Khrushchev's and other political leaders. The net result seemed likely to be a mixed one, somewhat similar to the similar struggle in the United States. You're just wasting ink at this point. The chief difference is that Soviet production and wealth is so much less than that of the United States that all such critical decisions must be made within much narrower parameters. In spite of these limitations of resources and demonstrations of inexperience and lack of competence parallel to that of the United States, the impact of the superpower was tremendous, especially in Eastern and Southern Asia and in the Near East. All right. The next section is the Cold War in Eastern and Southern Asia, 1950 to 1957. In the Far East, as a consequence of the Yalta Conference, the Soviet government decided that the chief feature of its policy in the post-war period would be public collaboration with the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. This non-communist area was to be held within limits by the Soviet control through local communist groups of various peripheral areas, of which the chief would be Korea, Outer Mongolia, Xinjiang, possibly Manchuria, and some portions of Southeast Asia. Soviet control of Korea was envisaged but as a threat to Japan as much as a buffer on nationalist China. The Soviet attitude towards China was reflected in the Sino-Soviet Treaty of August 14, 1945, which obtained Chiang's consent to the concessions which had been made on his behalf by Churchill and Roosevelt at Yalta. The most significant section of the agreement was in Molotov's notes of the same day, which promised that the Soviet Union's moral and material support be given entirely to the national government as the central government of China, and promised to end any Soviet support of the Chinese Communist in Xinjiang, since it had no intention of interfering in the internal affairs of China. As implementation of this agreement, Stalin summoned the Chinese Communists to Moscow, told them that the uprising in China had no prospects, and that the Chinese comrades should seek a modus vivendi with Chiang Kai-shek, that they should join the Chiang government and dissolve their army. Modus vivendi means a mode of living. The Chinese communists agreed, but returned to China to continue their struggle against the nationalist government. Only when that struggle was achieving its final success 4 years later did Stalin accept a communist regime in China and seek to bring it under his influence by means of the Red Chinese-Soviet Treaty of February 14, 1950. The lack of Soviet support for the Chinese Communists in the period of their final victory does not mean that Russians were completely loyal to their commitments with Chiang Kai-shek. They fully expected him to remain the ruler of China, but they wished to hem him in so that he would find it difficult to cooperate with the United States in any anti-Soviet policy in Eastern Asia. Accordingly, they not only expected the communists to remain dominant in Xinjiang, they were also eager to see them take over an additional zone or buffer belt in northwestern China and Manchuria. For this reason, the Soviet forces, in violation of the Treaty of 1945, yielded parts of Manchuria to communist rather than to nationalist Chinese forces as they withdrew from that province. Stalin's real concern in the Far East was Japan, which he feared might become an aggressive and militarized agent of the United States. He wished to participate in the military administration of Japan, but was excluded by the imperious MacArthur. There can be little doubt that the Kremlin under Stalin was much more concerned with getting a communist Japan than a communist China, and hoped to see the former reduced to economic and social chaos as a step on the way to a Communist Party victory there. All these hopes were frustrated. The growing prosperity of Japan, and especially the success of Ladijinski's agrarian reforms, steadily reduced the influence of communism, with the result that the Communist Party of Japan obtained less than 3% of the vote in that parliamentary election of October 1952 and lost all of its 22 seats in the Diet. As protection against such eventuality, Stalin insisted on the total demilitarization of Japan, the breakup of the industrial complexes like Mitsu, and possession or domination of surrounding areas such as South Sakhalin Island, the Kurils, and Korea. The decartelization of Japan, which was never seriously considered by the MacArthur regime, and the demilitarization, although guaranteed by the new Japanese constitution, was abandoned by MacArthur in the name of Japanese defense needs beginning in December 1950. These defeats in Japan made it all the more urgent that Stalin get control of all of Korea. But here again he met a resounding defeat which largely destroyed Soviet prestige in the Far East. The vital event in this process was the need for Soviet-dominated North Korea to call for Red Chinese help to bail it out of the dangerous situation to which the Moscow-encouraged attack on South Korea had brought it. Okay, to Southeast Asia. Stalin's disappointment in the Far East were also extended to the Southeast Asia. This area forms the triangle between the great land masses of India, China, and Australia. It is a jumble of islands and peninsulas occupied by a jumble of peoples of diverse origins and cultures. The indigenous peoples, with their animistic religions, have been subjected to cultural, religious, and political intrusions of very diverse characteristics. The chief of these intrusions have been those from India, China, and somewhat later Muslim influence from the West, and finally, in recent centuries, the political and commercial influence of Europe and America. For generations, there has been persistent Chinese immigration from the north. By 1939, there was only one independent state in Southeast Asia, Siam, Thailand, left as a buffer between the British areas of Burma and the Malay states to the west and French Indochina in the eastern portion of the Malay Peninsula. Southward of the peninsula, in a great sweep eastward to New Guinea, there multitudinous islands of Indonesia ruled by the Netherlands from Batavia on the island of Java. To the north of these islands were the Philippines, still under American administration in 1939. Between Java and the Philippines, the great mass of the island of Borneo had a fringe of British dependencies, Sarawak, Brunei, and North Borneo, along its northern coast, while far to the east, the eastern half of Timor was under Portuguese administration. Thus, all Southeast Asia, except Thailand, was under the colonial domination of 5 Western states in 1939. The interest of these imperial powers in Southeast Asia was chiefly strategic and economic. Strategically, these lands lay athwart the waters joining the Pacific with the Indian Ocean, a situation symbolized by the great British naval base of Singapore at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula between Sumatra and Borneo. Economically, these areas produced substantial qualities, of tin, rubber, petroleum, bauxite, and other products. I'm not sure if it's qualities or quantities, actually. More significant, perhaps, from the Chinese point of view, many parts of the Malay Peninsula were fertile, were substantially underpopulated, and exported great quantities of rice, especially from Burma. Western prestige in Malaysia was irretrievably damaged by the Japanese conquest of the Philippines, the Dutch Indies, and Malay in 1942, so that the re-establishment of the colonial powers after the Japanese collapse in 1945 was very difficult. Burma and the Philippines were granted their independence by Great Britain and the United States, respectively, soon after the war's end. French Indochina emerged from the Japanese occupation as the 3 states of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, each claiming independence, while Java claimed sovereignty over the whole Netherlands East Indies as a newly independent state of Indonesia. Efforts by the European powers to restore their pre-war rule led to violent clashes with the supporters of independence. These struggles were brief and successful in Burma and Indonesia, but were very protracted in Indochina. Burma became an independent state in 1948, followed by Indochina in 1949, by Malaya in 1957, and by Singapore under a special relationship in 1959. Controversy and intermittent fighting between Indonesia and the Dutch over Western New Guinea continued until 1962, when American pressure persuaded the Netherlands to yield, but left Indonesia, led by Ahmed Sukarno, unfriendly to the West. In all these areas, native nationalists were inclined to the political left, if for no other reason than the fact that the difficulties of capital accumulation and investment to finance economic improvements could be achieved only under state control. But such independent socialism merged into other points of view which were clearly communist. In some cases, such communism may have been ideological, but in most cases it involved little more than the desire to play off the Soviet Union or Red China against the Western imperialist powers. The communists of Southeast Asia were thus communists of convenience and tactical maneuver, and originally received little support from the Soviet Union because of Stalin's well-known reluctance to engage in political adventures in areas where he could not dominate the armed forces. But in February 1948, the new Cominform, sponsored by Southeast Asia Youth Conference at Kolkata, where armed resistance to colonialism was demanded. A communist revolt in the Philippines had already begun and was joined in the course of 1948 by similar uprisings in Burma, Indonesia, and Malaya. Most of these revolts took the form of agrarian agitations and armed raids by communist guerrilla jungle fighters. Since these guerrillas operated on a hit and run basis and had to live off the local peasantry, their exploitation of peasant life eventually made them decreasingly welcome to this very group for whom they pretended to be fighting. In the Philippines, the Huk Balahap rebels were smashed in 1953 by the energetic and efficient government of President Ramon Magsaysay. In Indonesia, Sukarno repressed the insurrection and executed its leaders. In Malay, where the communists were almost entirely from the Chinese minority, these rebels were systematically hunted down and destroyed by British troops in long-drawn jungle combat. In Burma, the long Chinese frontier provided a refuge for the rebels and were not eliminated until 1960. The real problem was Indochina. There the situation was complex, the French army was uncompromising, and communist leadership was skillful. As a result, the struggle there became part of the Cold War and contributed to a world crisis. The Malay Peninsula as a whole is dominated by a series of mountain ranges with their intervening rivers running southward from Chinese Yunnan. These rivers fan out in the south into fertile alluvial deltas, which have attracted invaders of Mongolian type from the less hospitable north throughout history. Even today, they produce surplus food for undemanding peoples. From the west to the east, the chief rivers are the Irrawaddy, the Salween, the Menam, the Mekong, and the Red River. Following this geographical pattern, political units have tended to fall into similar north-south strips with Burma and south-thrusting Malaya in the west, Thailand in the center, Laos and Cambodia in the Mekong drainage, and Tonkin with Annam in the east. Indochina brought considerable wealth to France, so that in the late 30s, the Banque d'Indochine spawned in France an influential political group who played a major role in the defeatism of the 1940s and the subsequent collaboration. After the Japanese withdrawal in 1945, the Paris government was reluctant to see this wealth, chiefly from the tin mines, fall into the hands of Japanese-sponsored native groups, and by 1949 decided to use force to recover the area. Opposed to the French effort was Ho Chi Minh, a member of the French Communist Party since its founding in 1920, who had subsequently studied in Moscow and had been a leader of the anti-colonial agitations of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party since 1931. Ho had set up a coalition government under his Viet Minh Party and proclaimed independence for Vietnam, chiefly Tonkin and Annam, in 1945, while the French troops, in a surprise coup, seized Saigon in the south. Unfortunately for Ho, he obtained no support from the Kremlin. The French Communist Party was at that time a major element in the French coalition government, with its leader, Maurice Thorez, holding the office of vice premier. Stalin had no wish to jeopardize the communist chances to take over France by his support for a remote and minor communist like Ho Chi Minh. In fact, Thorez signed the order for military action against Ho's Republic of Vietnam. At first, Ho sought support from the United States and from Chiang Kai shek, but after the establishment of Red China in 1949, he turned to that new communist state for help. Mao's government was the first state to give Vietnam diplomatic recognition, January 1950, and at once began to send military supplies and guidance to Ho Chi Minh. Since the United States was granting extensive aid to France, the struggle in Vietnam thus became a struggle through surrogates between the United States and Red China. In world opinion, this made the United States a defender of European imperialism against anti colonial native nationalism. During this turmoil, independent neutralist governments came into existence in the interior, with Laos to the north and Cambodia to the south. Both states accepted aid from whoever would give it, and both were ruled by an unstable balance of pro communist, neutralist, and pro Westerners. The balance was doubtably unstable because all three groups had armed supporters. On the whole, the neutralist group was the largest and the pro Western was the smallest, but the latter could obtain support from America's wealth. The decisive influence in the 50s, however, was that the communists, following the death of Stalin, were prepared to accept and support neutralism years before Dulles could get himself to condone it, a situation which gave considerable advantages to the extreme left. The intensity of the struggle in Vietnam increased fairly steadily in the years following 1947. The creation of the Common Form and the subsequent communist withdrawal from the coalition governments of Europe, including France, freed the Kremlin to support anti colonial movements in Europe overseas territories. At the same time, the re-established French army was left with a wounded pride which became, in some cases, a neurotic drive to wipe out the stains of 1940 to 1942 by subsequent victories in colonial wars. The growing aggression of Communist China and Dulles's fantasies about liberation all contributed to build the Indochina confusion into a flaming crisis. The final step came from the Korean Truce of 1953, which freed Red China's hands for more vigorous action in the southeast. The defeat of the communist risings of 1948 elsewhere in Malaysia turned the new Chinese activities full into Indochina, which had an open frontier for passage of Chinese communist supplies and advisors. This intensification of Chinese supported communist activities in Vietnam in 1953 to 1954 was quite contrary to the desires of the Kremlin, which was just entering the post Stalin thaw and already moving towards the Geneva spirit of 1955. At the same time, the readiness of Dulles and the French army to force a showdown in Vietnam was equally unacceptable to the British and to many persons in divided France. Out of these confusions came, on February 18, 1954, a Soviet suggestion for a conference on Indochina to be held at Geneva in April. By the early months of 1954, the communist guerrillas were in control of most of northern Indochina, were threatening Laos, and were plaguing the villages of Cochin China as far south as Saigon. About 200,000 French troops and 300,000 Vietnamese militia were tied in knots by about 335,000 Viet Minh soldiers and guerrillas. France was being bled to death, both literally and financially, with little to show for it, but the French army was obstinate in its refusal to accept another defeat. The French strong point at Dien Bien Phu was invested by Viet Minh on March 13, 1954, and by the end of the month, its outer defenses were crumbling. The French Chief of Staff, General Ely, flew to Washington and found Dulles willing to risk an all-out war with Red China by authorizing direct American intervention in Indochina. As usual, Dulles thought that wonders could be achieved by an airstrike alone against the besiegers of Dien Bien Phu, where the conflict increased in intensity daily. For a few days, the United States, at Dulles's prodding, tottered on the brink of war. Dulles proposed a united action policy, which he described in these terms. If Britain would join, the U.S. and France would agree to stand firm. The three Western states could combine with friendly Asian nations to oppose communist forces on the ground, just as the UN stepped in against the North Korean aggression in 1950. And if the Chinese communists intervene openly, their staging bases in South China will be destroyed by U.S. air power. President Eisenhower agreed, but his calls to Churchill and Eden found the British government opposed to the adventure. Of course, the Foreign Secretary hastened to point out that the Sino-Soviet Treaty of 1950 bound Russia to come to the assistance of China if it were attacked by the United States, as Dulles contemplated. Discussion at Geneva said Eden must precede any such drastic action. All right. I'm just going to stop reading there. Page 1045. A lot of pages left. All right. It's just kind of interesting how he's writing the book, because I just noticed it kind of like yesterday. But when he's talking about, the war in Europe, there's a lot more like description of like the damage and stuff that was inflicted, especially on like civilian populations. He keeps listing the amount of casualties and stuff that happened, in the bombing air raids and the machine gun fire, and points out specifically, especially like the Nazis and the concentration camps and the death squads. And he keeps on listing exactly how many numbers and how many bombs were dropped, and describing the destruction and all this other stuff. But then when it comes to the communism section, it's like a big soap opera of like Stalin's sneaking around with Khrushchev and Molotov are doing this, and he's only talking really about like what's going on in the party. And he just kind of like glosses over the starvation of like millions of peasant farmers, army raid, like death squads, putting people in the gulags, all that type of stuff is like completely left out of it, like to the point where you're just like it's almost like reading like a Game of Thrones type of like novel, where it's like, okay, then Khrushchev comes in and grabs the briefcase from this guy, and he was supposed to have his gun, and now he's the king, and now this guy's the king, and now he's in charge. And it's like they completely skip over the starvation of millions of peasants in the farms. They're like, yeah, they put a little bit more taxes on those peasants. Yeah. And then millions of people starve to death, and from like not being able to produce enough food and stuff due to the horrible centralized planning. And that's how Khrushchev was able to take over, was because of the fact that one of the main tenets of communism, centralized planning, never worked, even when it was like run by hardcore, like the original hardcore communists. And that's how Khrushchev was able to like take over, because he's like, wait a minute, if we just do this decentralized thing that actually works, just let the farmers run the farms, let the businessmen run their business, this is going to work better, and it's going to look better for me, because it's going to look like I'm actually able to run things better. And then we'll just pretend like it's centralized, and then I'll just give my, because the decentralization works so good, he was able to remove all the other like fake administrative bodies and just have his as the only one with veto power, like over the agricultural sector. And then it looked like he was in complete control and doing all this stuff when really in actuality it was the decentralization, which is like a capitalist Western idea, that was what was making his progress better than the centralized planning, which was horrible and starving everybody. You know, he very briefly talks about the getting rid of the intellectuals, right? It's like they were like putting smart people and military leaders and political leaders and probably philosophical leaders into like basically work death camps that were basically the same as the concentration camps in Germany. And he's like, just like, oh yeah, those workers, man, they were a little pissed off because they had to like pay a little bit more taxes and stuff. And they they were taking some of their food produce. It's like, bro, they were killing them in the farms. They were starving to death. People in the cities were starving to death. You know, people were so scared and distrustful of the Communist Party that probably half the people were just going along to get along because they didn't want to get shot in the head and disappeared and have their entire family lineage erased from history, or whatever they were doing. And he's just really kind of giving he's not really going in as hard on the communists as he is when he was talking about the World War II in Europe. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. And then you can see that within the like kind of Asian, Russian, and then the Western powers, they started doing these proxy wars like in Malaysia and Korea, and now we're getting into Vietnam because, as you can see, the Russians didn't want to start a nuclear war. They didn't want to. So the whole premise of the Cold War was kind of falsified in a sense because the Russians didn't want to start a Cold War, and I'm sure our top generals knew that in a certain sense, and it was more about like a show of force and the fact that all the scientists were working on the same thing than an actual threat. And a lot of it was designed just to fund the military that now is built up so much that, it's more of a threat to the citizens of this country than it is a threat to other countries at this point. So that's just my commentary on that section there. We'll get back into it more tomorrow, hopefully. So thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.